On Wednesday night at the Palace of Versailles, President Trump and Iran's president put their signatures on a deal. A deal meant to end a war that started in February. By Friday, everything had changed. Lebanon was experiencing its deadliest day since that deal was signed. Iran had announced it was closing the Strait of Hormuz again. And the framework everyone called historic just 2 days earlier was being described as hanging by a thread. In this video, we'll walk through exactly what was signed, what's actually in it, and how it started unraveling within 48 hours. Let's start with confirmed facts. On the evening of June 17, 2026, President Trump signed a hard copy of the U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding. The location was the Palace of Versailles in France. It happened during a dinner hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron after a G7 summit dinner. Witnesses included Secretary of State Marco Rubio and France's First Lady. A reporter asked Trump about it as he left Versailles. He said simply, "It's signed. Signed in Versailles. Just signed it." Hours later, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed his copy in Tehran. Iranian state media released photos showing him holding a document written in Farsi. At the bottom were what appeared to be both his and Trump's signatures. The U.S. sent the Iranians a photograph of the signed American copy as confirmation. Here's something notable. This signing actually happened 2 days earlier than originally planned. It had been scheduled for a ceremony in Lucerne, Switzerland on Friday, but it moved up to Wednesday in Versailles instead. Swiss officials confirmed the Lucerne plans were never finalized and ultimately changed. There's an interesting layer underneath this too. This wasn't actually the first signature on the document. 3 days before the Versailles signing, Vice President J.D. Vance and Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, had already digitally signed the same memorandum. So by the time Trump and Pezeshkian put pen to hard copies, the agreement had already been agreed to digitally. Wednesday night was, in a sense, a public ceremony, formalizing something that had already been settled, in principle, days earlier. Reports even noted that Trump had been musing, just hours before the dinner, about whether it was wise for him personally to sign the document at all. So what does this deal actually say? On Wednesday, a U.S. official read the text of the 14-point memorandum aloud to reporters on a call. Notably, neither side has released a physical copy of the full text publicly. And Iranian officials have not confirmed that the U.S.'s verbal account matches their understanding of the same document. With that caveat in mind, here's what's been described. The agreement declares an intent to bring about what's called an immediate and permanent termination of military operations in the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. It includes the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran agreed to allow safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge, but only for 60 days. After that, Iran will negotiate with Oman to define the strait's future administration. For context on why that matters, around 20% of the world's oil passed through that strait before the war began. On sanctions, the U.S. is expected to lift sanctions on Iran. It will also unfreeze certain funds and assets linked to the Iranian government, while allowing Tehran to immediately and freely sell its oil. There's also a $300 billion reconstruction fund attached to the agreement, according to reporting, though the funding sources for that remain unclear. Both sides commit to further talks toward a more substantive, final deal within 60 days of signing. That window is extendable if both sides agree to extend it. Now, on the nuclear question specifically, the memorandum includes an agreement for the U.S. and Iran to resolve how to dispose of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. But a senior U.S. administration official told reporters there's no pressing need to actually retrieve the radioactive material anytime soon. That's a notably relaxed timeline for what's supposed to be the central security concern of the entire conflict. A memorandum of understanding, it's worth being clear, is not a binding treaty. It doesn't require Senate ratification in the U.S., and either side can walk away from it without formal legal consequences. Trump has explicitly reserved the right to reinstate hostilities if he decides the terms aren't being met. Here's where the agreement gets genuinely vague, and it's the same fault line we flagged in earlier coverage of this deal: Lebanon. Al Jazeera's detailed breakdown of the 14 points specifically noted that the agreement leaves a large number of questions unanswered on several major sticking points. Lebanon is chief among them. Iran has insisted repeatedly and publicly that ending the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, is a condition of considering the conflict over. Israel, meanwhile, has said just as repeatedly that it isn't a party to this U.S.-Iran agreement. And it doesn't consider itself bound by it. This isn't a new disagreement. It's the same one we've covered before. What's different now is that the deal has actually been signed. Both presidents' names are on it, while this specific question remains unresolved. And the consequences of leaving it unresolved became very clear, very quickly. This is the part of the story that matters most, and it happened fast. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, by Thursday and Friday, just 1 to 2 days after the Versailles signing, Israeli airstrikes had killed at least 47 people. This happened amid what was described as intense fighting in southern Lebanon, according to Lebanon's health ministry. The Israeli military said it had struck at least 80 Hezbollah targets across southern Lebanon as fighting reignited. Reporting described it as the first major test of the fragile U.S.-Iran agreement. It got worse from there. CBS News reported that Lebanese officials said at least 18 civilians were killed in a single wave of strikes, making it, in their words, the deadliest attack since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed. Israel's military said its forces struck targets throughout southern Lebanon overnight. Hezbollah reported intense fighting in the area, and on the Israeli side, the military said 4 of its own soldiers had been killed in the fighting, including a lieutenant colonel, meaning this wasn't one-directional strikes on an undefended area. This was active combat, with casualties on both sides. This is also not the first time this exact pattern has played out in this war. Back on April 8, 2026, following a previous 2-week U.S.-Iran ceasefire, Israel carried out what it called its most powerful attacks on Lebanon. It killed over 250 people in a single day, according to Reuters. A separate strike on central Beirut, that same day, after Israel said the truce didn't apply there, killed at least 182 people, according to the Associated Press. President Trump told PBS NewsHour at the time that Lebanon wasn't included in that earlier deal because of Hezbollah. He called the Beirut strikes a separate skirmish. Iran's President Pezeshkian said, at the time, that a ceasefire in Lebanon was an essential condition of Iran's agreement with the U.S. That's the exact same position he's maintaining now, months later, with a new deal. So this is a pattern that has now repeated at least twice. A U.S.-Iran ceasefire gets announced or signed. And within days, large-scale Israeli strikes on Lebanon follow, with Israel maintaining the agreement doesn't bind its operations there. According to Africanews coverage of the earlier April episode, Israeli airstrikes had by that point killed more than 1,530 people in Lebanon across the broader conflict, including over 100 women and 130 children. More than 1 million people were displaced. Here's the part of this week's story that should be the headline, and largely hasn't been. Iran has announced it's closing the Strait of Hormuz again, or according to CBS News live coverage, this announcement came directly amid the trading of attacks between Hezbollah and Israel described above. Iran linked its own commitment to the Hormuz reopening directly to whether Israel honors the broader ceasefire, including in Lebanon. This is a critical detail because the reopening of Hormuz was one of the most concrete, market-moving parts of the entire deal. There's actual data showing how real that reopening had become before this setback. According to maritime intelligence firm AXS Marine, June 18 saw 25 verified commercial vessel crossings through the Strait of Hormuz. That's the highest single-day count since April 18th, and more than 5 times the average daily level recorded during the first 10 days of June. That's a genuinely significant, measurable sign that shipping confidence was actually returning. Iran's threat to reclose the strait puts that entire recovery at risk. It directly ties the economic centerpiece of the deal to a security situation in Lebanon that Israel says has nothing to do with the agreement at all. There was eventually a partial off-ramp. Officials reported that a truce was agreed between Israel and Hezbollah following what's been called the deadliest flare-up in fighting since the memorandum was signed. But truce, following the deadliest flare-up yet, is a very different sentence than the war is over. And it shows just how fragile the underlying situation remains barely 48 hours after a signing ceremony that was treated as historic. One more detail worth understanding, because it shows the deal is contested even within Iran's own government. Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who took that role after his father was killed in the strikes that began this war back in February, said Thursday that he had authorized the memorandum signed by the Iranian and U.S. presidents. despite, in his own words, holding a different view. He said he gave that authorization only after receiving assurances from President Pezeshkian and other senior officials that Iran's rights and the interests of what he called the resistance front would be safeguarded. Khamenei put the responsibility directly on Pezeshkian. He said that as head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Pezeshkian had personally accepted responsibility for ensuring the agreement protects Iran's interests. And he pledged that Iran would not yield if Washington made what he described as excessive demands. That's a remarkable thing for a supreme leader to say publicly about a deal his own president just signed, that he disagrees with it, that he authorized it reluctantly, and that he's holding one specific official personally responsible if it goes badly. It tells you the agreement doesn't have unanimous support, even at the top of the Iranian government, which adds another layer of fragility on top of everything happening in Lebanon. For balance, it's worth noting Iran's lead negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, struck a very different, far more confident tone. He said, "Everything we sought to achieve through military action, we obtained several times over through negotiation. It was not even comparable." That's a senior Iranian official describing the outcome as a clear win for Iran, even as Iran's supreme leader is simultaneously expressing reservations about the same agreement. So here's the honest summary of where things actually stand several days after a signing ceremony that was treated as the end of a war. There's a real signed agreement with both presidents' names on it. There's real economic movement, actual ships crossing Hormuz at 5 times the rate from earlier in the month. There's real diplomatic momentum, with a 60-day clock now running toward a more permanent deal. None of that is fake or symbolic. But in the same 48 hours after that signing, dozens of people died in Lebanon, in the deadliest fighting since the deal was signed. Iran threatened to reclose the exact strait the deal was supposed to reopen. And Iran's own supreme leader publicly aired his disagreement with the terms his president just signed. The pattern from April, ceasefire announced, large-scale Lebanon strikes follow within days, has now essentially repeated itself in June, almost beat for beat. A few things worth tracking from here. Watch whether the Israel-Hezbollah truce holds past this weekend, or whether it follows the same trajectory as April's 2-week ceasefire, which eventually broke down entirely. Watch Hormuz shipping data specifically. If vessel crossings drop back down after Iran's reclosure threat, that tells you the economic centerpiece of this deal is more fragile than the signing ceremony suggested. And watch Tehran's internal politics. If Khamenei's different view becomes more vocal, or if Pezeshkian faces real domestic pressure over how this deal is perceived to have turned out, that internal tension could end up shaping Iran's negotiating posture in the 60-day talks, more than anything happening in Washington. The short version, this deal is real, but it was tested within 48 hours of being signed, and the test did not go cleanly. Lebanon remains the fault line nobody has actually closed, and until that gets resolved, every other part of this agreement, Hormuz, sanctions the nuclear stockpile, sits on a foundation that's already shown it can crack fast. We'll keep tracking this as it develops. Subscribe if you want the next update as it happens. Thanks for watching.